Make sure you stay tuned in till the end of this video. After I go over all the camera basics, I'm gonna go over one tip that you need to know to make sure you get the absolute best footage you can get out of your camera. What's up everyone, my name is Michael Osman, welcome to my channel. Today we're starting a new series called How to Film Your Hunt Like a Pro. Now I'm not a pro, but I do know how to run a camera and how to properly set it up and properly expose it. So today we're going to go over the camera basics so you can get the best footage for your next hunt. We're going to cover frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and white balance. You know how to set all those up and you're going to get really good footage on your next hunt. So let's dive in. The first thing we're going to cover today is frame rate. What frame rate should you be shooting in? You have 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. Those are gonna be your most common ones that you're gonna see in most cameras that you get. Then you get up to 120, 240, 480. Those are gonna be more your slow motion frame rates. Better for B-roll if you wanna get that, or a good slow motion shot on a kill or a harvest. That's when you're gonna use those higher frame rates. So what frame rate should you use when you're shooting just all your regular footage, your A-roll footage? 24, 30, or 60? Well, the way it kind of works is the cinematic standard, since basically video started, is 24 frames per second because it has the most natural motion blur, which is the most naturally pleasing to the eye. So 24 frames per second is what you're gonna see any movie shot in. There's only been like a couple movies ever that have been shot in 30 frames per second. Now, a lot of TV is shot in 30 frames per second. For whatever reason, movies are always 24, but most of the stuff on TV is all in 30 frames per second. And it still looks just about as good as 24, it's just slightly smoother. So you can kind of pick between 24 or 30. Either one will be just fine. I've shot in 24 and I've shot in 30. You don't really notice that much of a difference to me, in my opinion. I shoot in 24 now just because I want to be able to use it for, try and get that really cinematic look. So I usually shoot in 24 frames per second. Another thing that's nice about when you're shooting in 24 frames per second is if you do shoot a shot in 120 or 240, then when you slow it down, you can slow it down to like 20%. So you can get it nice and slow, so you can get that really good slow motion footage when you do shoot those higher frame rates. And we'll dive into that later on when we go into an edit, and I'll show you how that works and how you can slow it down and get that really good slow motion footage. The next thing we're gonna talk about is shutter speed. So after you set your frame rate, next you want to set your shutter speed. Photography and videography are going to be different when it comes to shutter speeds because you can run your shutter speeds at a whole bunch of different settings when you're doing photography. But when you're shooting video, you want to go by the 180-degree rule. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, you want to double that. So basically you're going to shoot 1/50. Or 1/48 if you can. Most cameras are gonna be that 1/50. So if you have your frame rate at 24 frames per second, you wanna shoot your shutter speed at 1/50. If you're at 30 frames per second, you're gonna wanna have your shutter speed at 1/60. And the reason that you do that is because that's what helps create that most natural motion. If you use a lower shutter speed, so let's say you're shooting in 24 frames per second and you have your shutter speed set at 1/24. You're gonna notice that it's starting to get choppy, okay? It's not gonna be smooth. Or if you go the opposite way, and let's say you're shooting in 24 frames per second, but you're shooting your shutter speed at 1/100, you're gonna see it's like weirdly smooth. It doesn't have that natural motion blur. It just gets a super smooth look to it. So you wanna make sure that you're shooting double your frame rate. All right, now that we've covered frame rate and shutter speed, first thing you're gonna wanna do with your camera is set your frame rate. So set that to 24, 30, 60, or 120, depending on what you're planning on shooting. If it's your A-roll footage, definitely 24 or 30. If you want to be able to slow it down, you're going to want to shoot 60 or 120, or higher if you can, depending on what your camera does. After that, set your shutter speed. Now we're going to move on to aperture or f-stop. So basically the way your aperture works is if you have a high aperture, so let's say it's at like f16, f15, camera lens is not letting in as much light to the sensor, so it's gonna be a lot smaller. This is what you're gonna wanna do when it's super bright out and you're trying to keep the brightness from getting into your lens, basically. If you're shooting and it's darker, you're gonna wanna shoot in a very low f-stop or aperture, because then now your lens is opened up a lot more and letting a lot more light in. So in low light situations, you want to have your f-stop set much lower. In super bright conditions, you want to have your f-stop much higher because now it's not going to let in as much light. The other thing that this is going to do as well is when your aperture is super high, it's going to bring in a lot more things into focus. So basically, a lot of times if you're outside and you're shooting like landscape or something like that, or you want to just get a huge amount of view in focus, like a big shot, usually you're going to shoot like a higher aperture. So generally, if you want to shoot really good B-roll, you're going to want to shoot at a lower aperture because it's going to give it that more dramatic shallow depth of field. So that's when you're going to want to shoot in that lower, like somewhere between 2 and 5 range. Otherwise, shooting B-roll in a super high aperture where everything's just basically all in focus everywhere, it doesn't really separate your subject from anything. And so it makes it not quite as cinematic and dramatic. So generally you want to keep your f-stop low for B-roll. A-roll footage, you can kind of do whatever you want. You can have a higher aperture if you want, or you can shoot a lower aperture. That's up to you. Generally, it's best to try and keep it all pretty close together as far as where you want to shoot it. That's why I usually shoot most of my A-roll footage between 4 and 8. And then any of my B-roll stuff, I'm definitely shooting it down 2.4 to 4.5 is generally where I try and keep it. I don't usually try and go too much higher than that because I want to have that good dramatic shallow depth of field. All right, so next we're talking about ISO. So what ISO is it basically your camera is creating fake light. So the lower your ISO, the less fake light your camera's making and going to be the more clear image. So you always want to keep your ISO as low as possible. Once you start getting your ISO higher, then it's going to start getting a grainy look to it. They call it noise. And that's the thing we're trying to avoid. So that's why it's always best to set your ISO last so you can try and keep it as low as possible. Usually if you can keep it under 1,000, like in the 800 tops range is usually what I try and do. I mean, I try and keep it, 100 to 200, 400, 600, that kind of area. Like right now my ISO is set at 400 and it's gonna be a pretty good clear image. So I usually try and keep it as low as possible. The only times that you're really gonna wanna have your ISO high is when it's, super low light, like early in the morning, late at night, right after sunset. You're gonna have to have your ISO pretty high. You're gonna have your aperture wide open to try and let in as much light as you can, but it still probably won't be quite enough. It will depend on your camera too and how big the sensor is on your camera. And so you're gonna have to crank your ISO up at that point regardless. I mean, I have my ISO at 6,400 or 12,800 by the time I'm just getting done out of the stand usually because it's just that dark and that's the only way you're gonna be able to get any sort of image at all. So ISO, you just need to use it in the best way you can as far as keeping it low as much as you can. But at certain times, no matter what, you're gonna have to crank it up, but it won't be as clear of an image. And you'll see that if you practice with that. So white balance is one of those things that most people don't pay attention to. And I'm not super good at making sure my white balance is correct. A lot of times I'll use the settings that are already on the camera. Most cameras will have settings for your white balance and you can use the auto white balance where it will adjust it to whatever it feels like it needs, but your camera doesn't usually always do a great job at knowing what white balance it needs to be at. But they do have settings for like daylight and for cloudy or for incandescent lights or fluorescent lights. So you could always use those settings and it will get you in the area that you need to be because there's certain settings that it's supposed to be at for those lights. I know I've heard that for like daylight settings, like when it's bright outside, you're usually gonna be around 5,500 Kelvin. So 5,500K is what it's gonna say. Or for like cloudy, they say 6,500K is where you wanna be. So there's a lot of options you can do. Basically, you just wanna make sure your picture isn't too orange or isn't too blue. Because if you go too far one way, you'll see that you'll start getting an orangish color to your video. If you go too far the other way, you'll start getting a bluish color. So you kind of want to get that in between so you see that your colors are fitting in perfectly with what you're trying to film. Basically, when you're doing your white balance, you basically want to try and make sure that you're trying to keep all of your footage in the same range. You don't want something that's going to be super blue looking and then something that's super orange looking. You want to try and make sure that all your footage for whatever video you're shooting is going to be very similar in look. You don't want to have a bunch of different looks just because your white balance is off. And one thing that's cool about white balance is you can actually adjust your white balance in editing. So as long as you're somewhat close, you can adjust that and it won't really hurt the image or quality as long as it's close enough. If it's super far off, then your image quality might get a little worse as you adjust it. But as long as you get it close in all your footage for what you're shooting for that video, you'll be able to adjust it just that little bit and it'll fit in nicely. So you always want to make sure that you're keeping everything that you're shooting very close to what you want it to look like. Alright, so now that we've gone over all the camera basics on how to properly expose your camera, there's one final tip. Do not use auto. So every camera, whether you're shooting with a handy cam, a DSLR, a mirrorless, whatever camera you're using, do not set it to auto and just let the camera do the work for you. Your footage will never be as good. Most cameras have an auto setting, a shutter priority setting, an aperture setting, and basically what those are is they're just all auto settings, and your camera is going to decide what it thinks is best to expose your camera. And you'll see a lot of things just go all over the place, and your image will never be near as good as it could be. You want to make sure that your camera is set to manual exposure, so that way you are the one that is setting your frame rate, you are setting your shutter speed, you are setting your aperture, your ISO, and your white balance. If you go into these auto settings on your camera, like most people will, they'll just set it to auto and just let the camera do its thing, expecting it to be great. It will never work. You have to go into manual exposure and set everything yourself. It will be so much better. Your quality will be so much better. It's more work because you do have to make adjustments on the fly all the time. You're gonna have to adjust your aperture. You're gonna have to adjust your ISO. You're gonna have to adjust your white balance. But I promise you, if you want really good footage, you have to do it manually. Do not use auto, ever. Well, that concludes part 1 of the How to Film Your Hunt Like a Pro series. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. If you have any questions or comments, make sure to put those below and I will try to answer them as best as I can. If you want to see the next video and be notified, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell so that way you know when it gets posted next. The next video that I'm going to do is going over a few little pieces of gear and some tips on how to use it, so that way you don't have to make crazy adjustments on your camera all the time on the fly. Helps make filming a lot easier, especially when you're outside. So make sure to stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time.